The backend isn't just business, it's how you think. And in today's video, I'm going to be going through how systems are philosophies in disguise, how I'm actively thinking through these philosophies and implementing in terms of the vision for Killer Chaos OS. Like always, the main mission with these videos is to build our thinking OS, basically our own internal operating system that governs how we're able to build backend systems, and also to call in visionaries, basically the people that are aligned with what it is that we're actively solving for, which is chaos, and ultimately to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So, like always, every backend you build is more than operations. I like to think of, backend operations as, understanding that what you are building is basically laying the foundation for what's next. And what I mean by this is it's a reflection of how you think. And at scale, it's no longer about clicks, dashboards, or workflows, but rather it's about seeing signal in chaos, basically how you're able to see the value, through this chaos, and ultimately see what are the needle moving things within, this chaos that you can ultimately use as leverage to create into your personal life or even into your system as well. And ultimately to understand that you're basically turning raw complexity into compounding clarity. And I think clarity is one of those things that you ultimately just need to have in terms of building, back-end systems as well, because the clearer your mind is, the better you're able to, build that signal that ultimately leads to that level of clarity that allows you to then solve problems. Because I think one of the most important, modes, is understanding that systems are basically philosophies in disguise, and how and what governs these philosophies ultimately comes down to understanding that, hey, it ultimately comes down to seeing signal in chaos, and ultimately understanding that turning this raw complexity into compounding clarity also forms part of this philosophy. And with that, we also need to also make sure that we're understanding that, we're executing consistently under pressure as well. And what I mean by this is ultimately understanding that, most people do see systems as tools, but rather, I see them, as an operator. I see them as discipline, patterns, and resilience, basically as a means to how we're able to build into the future. And ultimately understanding that, once we master this perspective, we stop rather fixing businesses, but rather start reshaping reality. And I think, spotting these patterns, this discipline that we ultimately build throughout this entire journey, and also spotting the patterns, we're able to build, leverage within what it is that we're actively building. And understanding this, ultimately gets us closer to the main vision. And I think, ultimately understanding that, systems are these modes that ultimately build what it is that we're actively building, then we know that, hey, each and every single day we need to make sure that we're striving towards, building this grand vision of how it is that we're able to solve problems. But through that, we also need to understand that it is a reflection of how we basically think. And I think, ultimately, understanding that systems are, philosophies in disguise is ultimately the modes that allows us to understand that, hey, what are the philosophies or, our way of thinking that reflects how we're able to build systems. Because I think one of the most, important things that I have been thinking about lately is ultimately understanding that, the systems that you build are ultimately a reflection of how you think. And sharper systems just mean you have a sharper mind and also sharper signal. So ultimately then that leads us to asking the questions of saying, hey, how can we actively build a sharper mind? And also, that ultimately translates into, the systems that we're going to be building into the future. But through that, we need to make sure that we're building through signal rather than chaos. And how we actually do this is making sure that, we understand that most operators view this from a discipline, patterns, and resilience. How can we actively build the resilience within ourselves as well to make sure that our systems that we're actively building are robust, but also at the same time they actively serve a purpose, in the sense that we're actively driving forward what it is that we're actively building on a day-to-day. And I think one of the most important modes as well is that, ultimately we need to focus less basically on focusing on clicks, dashboards, or workflows. We need to make sure that we're just building compounding leverage that scales with time. And I know that, we're still in those, early phases where we're like still kind of figuring things out and understanding, from a first principles perspective, how to ultimately build these systems. But I think, ultimately, we just need to keep pushing the needle forward each and every single day, because through that we're then able to build this philosophy that is ultimately governing how we're able to build these systems. And I think, one of the most important, things to also keep in mind through this is knowing that the stack evolves and the tools change as well, but the philosophy baked into your system, that becomes proof of the inevitability. Ultimately understanding that stacks, your current stacks that you're ultimately learning today are ultimately going to evolve, and the tools that you're going to use are going to change. So how can you actively build this philosophy that governs how you're able to move into the future in a way that ultimately scales? And how we're able to do this means that we need to make sure that in our own perspective, we're building this philosophy or this, source of truth as well, and tying it with each and every compounding asset that we're building on a day-to-day, because each and every single day, we need to make sure that we're ultimately learning as well. And I think, that is one of the most important things, to ultimately understand that each and every single day, we are contributing towards this philosophy, this philosophy in disguise through systems that ultimately governs, how we're able to see the signal in chaos, how we're able to turn, complexity into compounding clarity. Because I think one of the most, like I said before, the most important modes is ultimately creating this level of clarity that ultimately breaks, you understanding what it is that you're actively doing. Because in as much as, within that present moment in time, you may say, hey, I actively understand what it is that we're actively doing. I think there's always a deeper level in terms of how you're able to build clarity, and through that clarity we're ultimately able to contribute towards this philosophy. But how we're able to do that just requires us taking those small daily actions that we can take on a day-to-day basis, because through that I know we're going to take one step closer and ultimately reach the end goal or the main vision for Killer Chaos OS, where we're ultimately reshaping industries, inspiring millions of people, and ultimately getting closer to the main vision. But through that we ultimately need to understand that we're building these philosophies through these systems, because these systems are a reflection of how we think, how we're able to execute as well. Because execution is one of the most important modes that we need to take on a day-to-day, because through execution we can then form those data points that ultimately allow us to build sharper and better into the future. And I think just ultimately understanding this builds that discipline to say, hey, each and every single day we're going to get 1% better in terms of building systems and making sure that they are a reflection of who we are and what it is that we're actively doing, and also spotting the patterns. Because I think that is also as important to understand that, hey, we are forming these patterns in terms of how we're able to build into the future, and through this we're forming clarity. And how can we form this clarity in a manner that allows us to also build signal and also use that as compounding leverage? And asking those questions ultimately gets us to that level of awareness that ultimately scales. But through this we also need to understand that we need to make sure that operators or the people that we look up to, we need to understand they see the world through a different lens, and they see it through resilience, how robust the systems are actively, and how they're actively able to scale into the future. And I know that we're still by far still in those phase where we're just actively just figuring things out and making sure that on a day-to-day basis we're figuring things out and we're pushing the needle as forward as we possibly can. But through that we need to make sure that we're building this philosophy or this source of truth as well that ultimately governs how we're able to build into the future. And I'm super excited as always to constantly just figure things out and solve problems, because I think the longer we're able to solve problems and just figure things out, rather than fixing businesses, but rather reshaping reality, basically through these patterns, and discipline and resilience that we're actively forming, I know we'll ultimately reach a new level of awareness that will get us closer to the main vision of Killer Chaos OS, which then becomes a question of how do we actually drive this, and making sure that system stacks are gonna evolve, and the tools are actively gonna change, but the philosophy that is baked into the system is ultimately what's going to become the proof of the inevitability. So how can we actively refine the philosophy that governs it through our thinking OS as well, to say, hey, this is ultimately gonna define how it is that we're gonna be able to build into the future. So let's make sure that when we build it, we do it right, and that we're actively pushing the needle forward each and every single day. And I know we're gonna get so many things wrong and we're gonna get some things right, but ultimately the most important thing is that we keep striving each and every single day to make sure that our systems and our philosophy that is in disguise is ultimately super locked in, that we're able to build the future in the way that we envision it on a day-to-day basis. But through that, we're going to struggle, we're going to make mistakes, and that is 100% part of the game. But ultimately, each and every single day, we just keep moving the needle forward and every facet that we possibly can. So yeah, I'm excited to keep pushing this needle forward. I wanted to keep this video a little bit brief so that I can just test out different things. Yeah, so I really enjoyed this video, making this video a little bit cooked, but ultimately that is all part of the game. We are in day 80, 83, 84, and yeah, so I'm excited. If you guys want to connect with me on X, Instagram, LinkedIn, and I will see you guys in the next video.